Good evening, everybody. This is Joysticks Jams. We're your hosts. This is the brilliant and talented Noelle. My name is Adam, and we're here to talk to you about game audio, specifically piggybacking off of the episode from 2 weeks ago, where you guys were had a great conversation about how to get started, the kind of gear that you need, what you're looking at spending, and ways to mitigate those costs when you're first starting out. From that episode, is there anything that you wanted to add that you thought about later, or that you were like, oh man, I wish I had talked about this?
Like, don't get too pumped right from the get-go. Definitely just know your budget and slowly build, and you'll get there.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I was kind of thinking about, especially in a creative field, is even if you have no money, create anyways. Use what you have, get started. If all you have is a laptop and you're making sounds on your laptop speakers and you're using a free DAW, and that's all you got, use it. Use your laptop microphone to record. Do whatever you can do, because there are a million different little skills that you're going to pick up on when you start adding sounds together and learning how they fit in the context of visual media and stuff like that. So even if you're not sure what to do, what to buy, you don't have the money to invest in it, just get to creating. That's the best thing that you can do if you're going to be a creator is to just create. And then as you do that, you'll start to pick up on what equipment you need or what kind of software you're going to need in order to do the things that you want to do.
Yes. And then you do really learn as you go, oh, that would make my life easier right now if I had this one thing. And then, I like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the gear talk was great that you guys had, talking about using the Focusrites. That was the first audio interface card that I got, was a Focusrite. I think it had the 2 inputs, and I still have it. That's the one that I carry with me if I'm going out somewhere, because like you said, you can throw it at a wall and it'll still go.
He's a adorable little boy. I'm using one right now. I
right.
love it.
Right. The only reason I got a different one is because the one that I have now has MIDI in and out.
Oh, nice.
And that's really the reason that I got it. It doesn't work necessarily any better than the Focusrite that I had before in terms of translating audio back and forth between the computer, but the MIDI in and out was kind of important to me. But so you guys were having this great conversation about the gear and stuff like that, but I feel like there's also you have to, as a creator, kind of start developing what and who you are as a creator. So when you're approaching a project, Noelle, and somebody gives you a piece of visual media, whether it's film or a game, where do you start? What do you do when you get that piece of media and have no audio for it whatsoever?
A lot of it, especially in the film industry, is a little bit different than the game industry. The film industry, you're working almost directly with that director and making their dream come to life. So you're kind of altering your skill set to help them achieve what they need.
Sure.
So if I'm normally more in a cutesy kind of mood and it's a horror movie, I can't just do my cutesy fun sound effects. I gotta, pander to the game. So it's a lot of conversating with who you're working with. And in a sense, it's kind of like that in the game industry too. It's their product first, and then you're helping make that product a whole better. You're elevating their dream to become more of a reality for them, and so it's just a lot of communicating. And then, but in games you have a little bit more leniency in that it's empty. You don't have anything to work with that wasn't shot on a set first. You don't have dialogue to work with. It is literally ground zero, and in that there's so much freedom to experiment with does this shoe texture work on this texture, try to get your character's footsteps working, and it's a lot more creative that way, just starting from ground zero.
Sure.
I'm not sure exactly how that's with composition. How do you start with composition?
So, like you said, I think the important thing is to realize that that particular piece of media, whether it's film or a game, which we're working with games with joystick jams, that game is not about you. And that's especially important for musicians to realize. Now, there are exceptions, music oriented games and things like that, but typically you're there, you're supporting cast. And it's hard for a musician sometimes to not want to be in the spotlight. You want your music to be, this powerful, moving experience, but you have to balance that with the fact that the game's got other things going on, and you have to be prepared to let go of the player's attention and compose something. It doesn't mean that your composition is any less powerful, but you have to be prepared to compose something that makes space for the gameplay, so that the player isn't pulled out of the experience of playing the game. When you approach something like that, and you're like kind of thinking about, okay, I've got this game in front of me and there's no sound in it, what's the first thing that you start thinking about? What's the first like sound effect that you're going for?
I always like to start with the backgrounds, like the ambience of like the rooms they're in, of the area they're in, the world. I think that helps set the tone for everything else. So like, oh, I'm on this new planet and it's like barren, and so you get to like have like a bunch of winds and stuff, and then that you'll know exactly what like frequencies and stuff are already being kind of used. You're not going to be stepping on them. I think it just gives you just a really good start. Is to just do everything atmospheric first.
Yeah,
I think I've always
absolutely.
been that way.
Yeah, for sure. Ambience is hugely important, and it's important, whether you're a composer or a sound designer. You got to be working together with the other audio people, because um, again, as a composer, you want to support the emotional feel of that, and a lot of that comes from things like ambiences and the sounds that are in the game, and so you kind of again have to kind of compose with the idea of, I need to make space in these frequencies and make sure that these sounds and these timbres will come through. And one of the things that as composers I've noticed is trending a lot lately, because I listen to a lot of game music, is composers will not use like a traditional drum set or like drums with a lot of high end in it, because then it gets in the way of the sound effects. Instead, they're using a lot of like, even during combat, they're using a lot of like taiko drums, really low, timpani-esque type, very kind of booming timbres in their percussion. And then when things are a little bit more calm, a lot of times there won't be any percussion at all, and all of the rhythms will come from the pitched instruments. So
Nice. I like that. I like knowing that.
it
I think as a design, like from a sound design standpoint, I love when I have a composition first.
uh
Um, and I wish that was kind of always the reality, because then I can play with sometimes like they're like pitched instruments as like a note. I'm like, ooh, I can like totally like meld this like cool whoosh moment into that. Oh, it makes my life as a designer so much like easier having the composition first. And I don't know if that's the same, like if anyone else would agree with me on that. But I love working with composition instead of working and then, oh shit, oh no, I have to like redo this because it just isn't meshing right at all.
right. And it's interesting, like I kind of do both, and I've kind of approached it both ways, with sound design first and then with the composition first. And I think both are doable, but and in regards to, like you said, fitting the sound design to the composition, approaching it from the position of at least having a little bit of musical background, you can actually start pitching some of your sounds around. Even though they're not really pitched sounds, you can kind of move that frequency response a little bit around and kind of have it fit with the key of the music. And then it just sounds, and it's really super subtle. You don't It's not something that you would necessarily notice unless you were looking for it. But it just makes everything play together really nicely and just fit and feel more cohesive.
Yeah, I love that kind of polish. Nothing beats that. When you can just hear something like nothing clashes. I hate dissonance a lot, and I think that's one of the reasons I was never really into music.
Yeah.
It's because there's ways to use it and use it well, but whatever I hear, I'm like, eh.
Right.
So when sound design and sound effects work together and without any kind of dissonance to each other, it's just
yeah, it's absolutely super satisfying. UI sounds are really important for that. Like if you're using a lot of UI sounds are pitched. They're just little trills and things like that. And if you're using the key signature of or the scale that the composer used, then it just sounds super satisfying when you're scrolling through menus, and it doesn't get as tiring to the ear. But one of the things that I kind of think about, like, is in horror games and things like that, is they do use dissonances because it's really uncomfortable to hear, and it's unsettling. And that's kind of one of the ways that game audio is like so important. And I feel like game audio is really easy to overlook, especially for younger or newer developers, because there are a lot of like asset packs out there that they can just download some music, they can just download some sound effects off of Splice or SoundCue or any of those, and throw some stuff in the game, and it will have sound effects and it'll have music. But will it fit? Will it drive the emotion forward? What do you think about that? Like, what do you think about the like just these younger developers just downloading stuff off the internet and then just throwing it in the game?
I think it works. So let's say they're attempting just to pitch the game somewhere, just to have like a base sound for them to like use to like resell in a sense, or get a distribution type of thing.
Sure.
It's valid, but if you want things to actually feel real, you're going to need to just get an audio person in there, get their feedback. They know what's going to work. They know that this person has a certain type of shoe texture, and just downloading dirt footstep isn't going to work.
Right.
It'll be there and it'll fill the space, but it won't feel polished. It'll feel cheap.
Sure.
So it works back and forth. It's the same thing as like using any assets on like those Unity stores, but it's always better just to have someone who knows what they're doing do it.
For sure. I kind of think of it like art assets. Like, yeah, you can download something off of the Unity store and you can make a game, and that's maybe a great way to bang out games quickly and hone your craft. But if you're going to go commercial with it, you need that polish.
For sure. It's strictly just for someone getting started, or like just like I said, getting it to a point where it's pitchable, and then going back and getting actual assets in there. It shouldn't be something that anyone commercially is doing. But I feel like I've seen it happen.
Yeah, I think we all have. I think it's like I said, I think audio kind of gets overlooked sometimes, and maybe that's just from like the audio perspective when we want to complain. But I think a lot of budget goes into like getting these 3D graphics.
Oh yeah.
Really right, and particle effects and water and all that stuff. But when it comes to audio, that can kind of get overlooked, and it can really ruin the immersion of your game if your audio doesn't sound right. And it takes a trained ear like yours, where you've been doing this for a long time, and you know what to listen for, and you know when something's not right. I think that's almost one of the most important skills, is just to know like something's not right with this. I don't know what it is yet. I can go find it, but something's not right with this. It's not sitting right.
I used to work in the Foley room a lot, and just that like not working right sound was the pinnacle of getting Foley to be right. It's like it just needs a little something deeper, something bassier, something with more like weight. That was like always the thing. Like, does this sound like the character. You just keep looking at him like, and you just play it back over and over and over again. It's like still missing something, still missing something. You're like, it's a little too high pitched. And so that is the pinnacle of getting games to just sit. You guys have to sit and listen. Like, this could be better. This could be better. Even if it's like taking what you did record, you're like, okay, this is the speed. This is the like most of the sound elements I need, and then taking that into like a plugin and just like giving it the extra oomph it needs.
Sure.
Or pitching it and doing all the extra little stuff, reverbing it. But yeah, that is the most of what you do in a Foley soundscape for gaming is just sitting and re-listening and making sure it is pinnacle. And I think another thing with audio being like the second thing, it's like, or like just not as important, is the fact that if audio is done well, you aren't noticing it. In a sense, it is meant to just like feel like it's there, and if it's not there, you notice, and if it is wrong, you notice. But if it's perfect, you're barely acknowledging its existence, other than music. And that's why I love music so much more, because I love video game compositions. All I do is in my house is like sit and listen to like OSTs and stuff to like Legend of Zelda, and you're like, oh, this was like an emotional scene. This was just a good experience to be in. This environment was good to be in. So I like that composition can always shine in that way. And it's not as just like forgotten, like, oh yeah, that footstep didn't actually like register on a normal person, but like I would spend a day making sure it was perfect, kind of thing.
Sure. And you spend a lot of time on it just for it not to be noticed, but I think if you've ever played a game with a bad audio in it and you just can't focus on the game and having fun if it just sounds wrong. And one of the worst things that I think for me as a composer, somebody can do is to mute my track. Like, the last thing I want you to do is go in there and turn the music off. I want you to be enjoying it, and I don't want it to get boring, and I don't want it to get repetitive, and I want it to be interesting for you, so that while you're playing the game, that emotional driver is still there. So it can feel ungratifying when you're talking about like doing the audio and not having somebody notice, but you also kind of know in the back of your head, like, if they do notice it, then I just ruined the game. Like,
yeah.
So
taking yourself out of it, you're like, it's so good, but you don't know what I did, but it's okay, it's there.
Right.
I hear it.
So talking about that, there are a lot of different ways that we use sound in a game, and not all of them are just for like immersion or realism. Not all of them are just for emotional drivers like the music. Audio can do a lot of different things in there, and sometimes it's not even necessarily a realistic audio experience if you think about it. Have you dealt with anything like that? Any of the like hyper-realism type stuff?
Hyperrealism, not extremely. My big like draw is the realistic sounds. That's what I'm most comfortable with. I think it's the easiest for me to grasp. But in one way, hyperrealism, in a sense, is like UI. So like you're sitting there with low health, you hear the beeping. Like obviously there's not real beeping, but your brain is like, shit, this is telling me I need to make sure I'm healing. Or one thing that used to scare me as a kid all the time was like if you're in like a swimming part of a game and you start to drown and everything just starts beeping and the music is really intense. That was the worst for me as a kid. I hated that. And I would just avoid any swimming levels all the time.
Yeah, it's really intense, and there have been games, I can't think of any off the top of my head at the moment, but games where, if you get in a situation like that, like, you start getting filters on the sounds where it feels like the sound is closing in on you as you start to drown and are losing health and whatnot, and it becomes really intense experience.
I like it more now as an adult, but as a kid, I think that was a source of so much of my anxiety. Like, it really does get to you, just like, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit.
Yeah.
Even like games like Mario, simple cute games could get you just that hype with either the soundtrack going or go 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 go, and it's crazy what it can do to you. And I would play games with my sound off sometimes because I just couldn't get through a level with like how intense it could get.
Sure.
But yeah, I do think that's just something insane that only audio can really get someone in that state. Like if I was just seeing that visually, it was nothing. It was
Right.
like, oh no, I'm sinking. Like it does not process as much as it does when I have something in my ears being like, this is the end.
Right.
I don't know why audio is the only one thing that can do that for me, but it really is.
It's so important, and I think that the reason it's so important is because as people we're so visual. Most of the time, that's where we get most of our information about the world is just by looking at it, barring a disability. But we never turn, like, you close your eyes, but your ears never turn off. Like, you're always hearing something. It doesn't matter how quiet you think it is, there's some kind of sound there. And so to not have that experience is in itself kind of jarring, and not immersive, because then this sense that, like, during your day-to-day life is always on and always going isn't there, and you're not having that experience within the game. But it's like one of the things that you were talking about as far as like that sort of sound when you're drowning and stuff like that. You're not just like creating an emotional element there, you're also telling the player, hey, like, you got to look out, right? Like, you're informing the player, and that's like an important gameplay element. The player has to know what's going on in order to respond to it. So how do you approach, like, when to inform the player and when to, like, let the game inform the player on its own?
I feel like it always has to work with the visuals. So like sometimes you'll see like a countdown, and then that's when you'll trigger your sound to go with it, and then keep increasing the intensity as the countdown keeps going. So that takes a lot of working together. Another thing I think is like dialogue cues.
Mm-hmm.
So that's also technically something we do, is like record dialogue and get it to going. But it's like someone's like, hey, something's over there, and then you hear like a pinging sound, like that would trigger something to ping.
And that's something that you've worked with a lot, is dialogue, right?
Yes, I did a lot of ADR recording and editing, and I've implemented it a couple times. Still not my forte, but that's something I absolutely have to get into. I'm excited to eventually dive into that. But dialogue tells you a lot. And as a kid, you don't really. I feel like I always press the A button, just like go 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 go. I don't care, I don't care, I don't care. But that is your main key. Is your character being like, I think we should go this way, or someone else telling you like, this is your new location. And so there's so many ways that audio does give the player what it needs to do, and you just don't even realize it. Like as I'm sitting here thinking, like, oh wow, no, dialogue tells me, oh no, that there's like a little sound thing over here. And it's crazy how much audio can have an effect.
Yeah, for sure. And like the one example that they gave us in school was like the game Limbo, and if you've ever played it, it's like a little side-scrolling puzzle-ish game, and you come across this barn, and you have to get into the barn, and one of the things that you have to do is climb this rope. And the art style of Limbo is in itself kind of like ambiguous. It's sort of silhouetted, and so if you didn't know, like, to look for that rope, you might spend too much time getting frustrated at the entrance of that to move on in the game. But they added a sound, and the sound was the rope swinging. But if you've ever had a rope swinging, it doesn't really make a sound, right? It doesn't have a sound unless it's banging off of something. But they added that like creak that you would hear if you had the rope taut and whatnot. And it was a really great sound design because it didn't feel unnatural. It didn't take you out of it. It didn't make you feel like the game was giving you something that was unrealistic, but really it was unrealistic. And I think that that's kind of one of the things that people like you who are specifically in audio do so well, is like you're even able to take sounds that don't belong there and make them feel like they belong in that world.
And I think that works really well with working with composition. Like, once again, there's so much tone that has to be set before we can try to even attempt to do something like that. Because like the music was doing something so different, and out of nowhere I tried to do something kind of like more like a swing type of sound, like a metally swing. That wouldn't have worked. It wouldn't have fit the image. It wouldn't have fit that the more horror-esque type of sound. It would be too bright. Um, so it just really is. There's so much working with everything. It's not just, oh, I can just put the sound design element in there and be great. It has to constantly be aware of everything else around it. What the player is looking at, type of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. From the composition into things, like one of the most important things that you can learn when you're mixing music is that it's called, I think, the Fletcher Munson curve, um, of your ear's audio response. Like, we hear sounds that are in that dialogue range, the sound of the human voice, higher than any other sound, even at the same energy levels, the same, you know, air pressure levels, if you will. We will perceive the sound of a human voice higher at a higher volume than we will any other sound. And so when you do have dialogue, even if it's dialogue that's happening in the background, that's instantly going to attract your attention. And so you have to be super careful as a composer about that frequency range, because if you aren't, then you're going to be covering up things that are happening in that dialogue that are important.
Like, what are some ways you go about like having to change, like, let's say you had like a piece ready and you're really like excited about it, but then you put it in and it just isn't working? What are like your steps to go around and attempt to get it to work frequency wise and just like more ambience wise?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of little tricks that you can do, depending on who's doing the audio integration and how involved that gets. Some things are as simple as just putting a little compressor on there, and then when sound effects or dialogue comes in, it just ducks the music down a little bit, but you have to be careful about that because it's noticeable if you go too hard. So at that point, if you're putting music into the game and you're just like, this is not sitting well with the rest of the the audio that's going on, one of the things I do is I'll pull that audio and I'll put it into the DAW while I'm composing, and I'll start mixing to that audio. So now I'm able to, with those sound effects in my DAW while I'm composing, I can kind of like, okay, this is the instrument that's getting in the way. Let's change that out for a different instrument. Or, because a lot of it's just sound selection when you're composing. So if you select the right sounds, mixing it is easy. It takes a day. But if you have the wrong sounds and then you're sitting there spinning your wheels trying to throw EQs and compressors and all these different things on there trying to get the sound to play right, find the sound that's messing up, get rid of it, replace it with something else, and you could fix all your problems right there. So that's kind of how I approach it. If something's not fitting right, is I'll throw it all into the same session and listen to it together.
That makes a lot of sense. What is like your first step in like making an audio track, like, or like just a composition for a basic game?
So if there's something for me to play, I play it. If there's not something for me to play, then I at least get whatever concept art and other like design features available and get a feel for the setting, and that's where I start. I'm doing a game jam right now. It's for Metroidvania month. It's on itch.io, and some of the art that they're doing for that is kind of this sort of like underground desert temple type thing. And so that's where I started. I started with Middle Eastern instruments and found a great like Middle Eastern drum loop off a splice that worked really well. And that's where I started because I knew that it was just going to fit with the art. I knew that it was going to fit with the setting. And then lucky for me, I'm doing all the sounds on the game, so I can make all of it fit together by myself. But it's a lot of work, but it is also kind of easier in a way because you don't have to like all of a sudden I'm getting this asset canon of 1,000 sounds, and now I got to make sure that you can hear them over the music. But really, emotions are tied to setting, and then again, if you have dialogue like you were talking about, or any kind of important story elements, it's really important to get a feel for those before you go into a composition because it's an emotional driver. And so if you're looking at the scene and it's kind of a bright, cheery scene, but actually at this moment in time, something really somber and sad is happening, you need to know that before you start composing something really bright and cheerful and somebody just died. So,
be a little inappropriate.
right. Oh, there's carnival music and this guy just blew up or whatever, but that's kind of where I start is you can get a good feel for the emotion of the scene off of the art, and you take direction from the game designers and the director, and they'll tell you if you're going a wrong direction. And sometimes I'll shoot. When I started composing this one, I would shoot them little melody clips and things like that to say, hey, does this feel right to you guys?
I had a similar thing with a game. I can't talk too much about it because it's not a thing yet. But it was like that. I got a concept art. That was all I got at first. Was just what this character's gonna look like. And so I did. I took like 5 different versions of what I think something from them was gonna sound like. I was like, okay, so are any of these really fitting that image for you? And I would make them pretty drastically different, so I knew exactly what type of emotion and what type of like sound that they were really trying to hear. So I think that is a really great way of just like constantly like being like talking back and forth, like, hey, so this is what I got from your art. Is this exactly what you're thinking? And it's fun also. I think starting with concept art, I love doing that because you're like, oh, I have so much design like options right now.
Yeah. No, that's brilliant because I feel like a thing that kills so many projects, games or otherwise, is a lack of communication. And as long as you have communication with the other creatives that are working on that, then you can really create something cohesive. That's a brilliant way to do that too, is if you only have concept art, create several different things. I thought that's a great idea. I don't want to get into like NDR territory, so I won't ask you too many questions about that. But what else do you think you could add to that? What else have you used to drive kind of like your imagination when you're thinking about the sound on a game?
I really liked also on that game actually is that they gave us like the basic like log line of like what their environment and their story was.
Mm-hmm.
And that like makes your mind go like it's kind of like when you're reading a book and then you end up like in the universe of the book and you stop reading and you're just in it. So in that I just let those basic like 3 sentences of this is kind of what we're going for. This is the environment. This is what she's doing. And then just let my mind go into that universe as much as I can in my own way, and then attempting to see it from someone else's eyes. Like how potentially could someone else perceive this world?
Sure.
And is it dark? Is it happy? And it's just being open, I think, is the biggest thing. Being like, oh, just your mind might not be right. And I feel like that's the same with composition, same with how dialogue sounds sometimes. Like, sometimes you can't use this guy's gruff voice for this scene because it just isn't working. It doesn't work for this character. It's not his vibe. You
Sure.
need to have someone who has a brighter voice. So it's just being very open to change and being like, okay, this isn't actually how I'm perceiving, and being able to switch your perception is the biggest thing in audio, I think.
Sure. Sure. Do you ever like have you ever started a project where you actually had like some gameplay elements available for you?
Yes. So same one. This is a really cool group to work with, and I one day pray I see it somewhere so I can be like, hey, I did this. But it's
Good.
one of those things you just never know.
Right.
Because games a lot of the time get shelved. Like you give them so many assets, and out of nowhere it's like it's never it never even as I said you can't use any of those assets. It sucks.
Sure. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
game audio world is like that a lot, especially in the indie world. You just never know. You never know.
Yeah.
But they would occasionally, as soon as they got something running in their system, they would send us a small clip of that. So like there was like an enemy and we had his like motions and stuff, and I was like so excited. I was like, oh my god, because like it's not what I expected from him. Because I had the concept art and I was like, okay, so he's gonna be kind of goopy. He's gonna be like
Right.
a goopy guy. But then I saw his feet move and they're just so tiny, but his upper torso is huge. I was like, oh my god, this is exciting because you just have to keep playing with like making it sound both big and small, and it was, oh, I loved doing that. And I think that was my favorite thing I worked on in that game was just this enemy, and I hope I see him come to fruition.
So speaking of that, like that feels like a really like cool, even like just like a gameplay element to see this weird little like blob with tiny feet walking around. Do you ever think about like specific sounds? Like I don't know. An example would be like the Legend of Zelda. You know when you open a chest, like it's the
Love that
same
sound.
sound from Zelda to Zelda to Zelda. They change the instrumentation, the speed of it, but it's always the same da 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 da. Do you ever think about that when you're going into a game? Like, what is this one sound that I want people to remember from this?
I do that even character based. So, we have this like character, and they're always wearing this certain outfit, and it always has this certain element to it. And like I always include that element in no matter what motion I'm using. So if they're walking, that element is being heard. If they're jumping, if they're attacking, that element always has to be in there for me. That's just one way of always making sure this is this character.
Sure.
So I think that is like a big time I always use that. But no, I think it's also really helps keep consistency in your game. If you're just constantly changing random elements, it's just not going to feel right. So if you always have like certain type of character, certain type element, or like these are all like objective based sounds, they all should have the same key or just same texture to them. So that way you're never being like, where'd that come from? It was too jarring.
Sure.
So I do think it's very important to keep key elements constant.
I think there's some really good points about that, and it's applicable to composition too, because if you have a character and that character is, somebody that you see throughout the game, you're going to want to keep their, like, have a specific melody for them. And then when you introduce another character, you can play with this other character's melody against theirs, and it keeps things consistent. And this is something that, like, composers like Nobuo Uematsu did a lot with the Final Fantasy series. If you go play Final Fantasy VI, like every character had their own theme, and when those characters were in the spotlight, that's the theme that would play. So you were focused on that character's story arc, and so as a composer, um, we talked about like going in and looking at the setting, but you really have to have a feel for the characters as well, so that when you're going from scene to scene or level to level, you're thinking about that consistency that you were talking about melodically and harmonically. so that the emotional driver is consistent for that character. Um, but when I guess when I think about sounds like the Zelda chime and stuff like that, and these are games that have been building that sort of familiarity for 30 years. So it's a little unfair to compare a brand new project to that. But coming from the sound design perspective that I've done some of, it's just, I think it would feel very satisfying to me to come up with something like that, whether it was a UI sound or something along those lines that, like, you knew it was that game. Like, somebody could put that on their ringtone and you knew it was from that game.
I think that's a dream for sure for any sound designer to like come up with like the perfect mnemonic.
Right.
Oh, I couldn't imagine. I take my little victories and like I remember doing a project for I think it was Berkeley,
Mm-hmm.
but they had us redo a UI for like a food app, so it was just like a redesign. And I
Yeah.
was like, oh, it would be so funny if I just make everything with my mouth. So like that was like my reoccurring element, and because it made sense because it was food, and so like I always just made little pop sounds for all my UI, and oh, that was fun.
I think I remember doing that project, and I think it's actually on my demo reel on my website.
I
That
think mine's on my
project.
website too, or I just started to build a website. It's not live because I can't afford it to go live yet.
All of
But I just
the
started a job, so it's okay. But it was
all
fun.
yeah, of all of the projects that I think we did in that class, I think that was one of my favorites. That was one of the more fun ones to do. Because you just got to go wild with it, and like you said, use mouth noises and just kind of be extra creative with how you came up with the sounds.
And you just also don't realize, especially in those app type games, how much UI drives the player. Or just like it satisfies them in a sense. Because they're very simplistic games. So if you don't have a good little, every time you move the character, or like let's say what's that game? My dad used to play Candy Crush. If we didn't have those cute little swipe sounds or explosion sounds, that game would not be what it was. And it's just like all it's, I don't know. I just like it.
Yeah, for sure. No, you're right. And that was one of the things that I think they talked about is like these sounds need to be satisfying. Even the sounds when you weren't successful at clicking on something in a menu or couldn't do something, it still needed to sound kind of satisfying, sound kind of like, yeah, I didn't have enough coins or XP to do the thing, but it wasn't like discouraging. I guess that's kind of what I'm thinking of, the word I'm thinking of. I apologize, I'm going to kill my cat.
No, he's cute.
Is you don't, even though you want to give the player negative feedback sometimes, you don't want to discourage them.
Oh no, for sure. And then especially in a game like that, everything's about selling. You're trying to get people to spend actual money on those types of games. So it's like, hey, if you do this, then you can click on this, and like something's like flashing or something.
Sure, sure.
But yeah, in a sense, it is all about like you being satisfied as a player, and I think it's in a sense a type of ASMR. Playing those types of games. I feel like slot machines, especially if you ever go to a casino and you just hear that cacophony of
Oh, it's brilliant.
it's insane. It's an art to keep someone sitting in one spot for that long. And it's gotta, like, if it's...
And giving you money.
Oh,
Like, you're feeding machine into a money to hear these sounds and see the lights flash up.
it's literally ASMR for most people. It is how they just sit in one spot. Because if you don't have something drawing you there, I would have been gone. Or if I heard the same track over and over and over again, I would have been gone after like 2 plays. I couldn't do it. So
Definitely, definitely. And one of the things on that topic is, like, as far as player satisfaction, coming from a composer standpoint, is one of my favorite things to do is make the music super interactive with the player. And I have to be careful with that. I've gotten into trouble going too hard on that, and then it kind of got in the way of the other sounds, and so I had to pull back on it. But one of my favorite things, and you can hear this in things like Tears of the Kingdom and stuff like that, is when you're doing one thing and the music is there, and then you go to do another thing and the music is still there. It's still the same music, but now something else has been added to it, or something has evolved to reflect the new thing that you're doing. And it's really complex. It's really hard to do.
Couldn't imagine. I took one composition class. I was like, okay, this is way more complicated than my mind thought it was. Because it is like that. Because you told me you had like all these different character themes, but when they introduce each other now, they're interacting. But not only that, you're in an environment, so they also have to work with the environment they're in. So like, you had like your level sounds, but then you also have it's. I could not imagine getting all those to constantly evolve. So like, what are some steps to like? Do you have any steps that you take to make sure they are meshing together well?
Trial and error. One of the things that I do, and not every musician can or wants to do this, but I try to learn the game engines, and at least a little bit of the scripting, because then I can communicate a little bit better to the programmers. Hey, I want to make the music react to this thing that the player can do, or this element, and so then I can give them that feedback, and they can put the information in that I can then respond to in the music. And that goes either if I'm doing the integration or not. But the other side of that, is you mentioned that your characters, they have these sounds that are always, like, anytime they move, anytime they do something, are always playing. And so if I'm making a score that is long because you don't want it to get repetitive, and is reacting to as your characters are coming in and going, I have to keep in mind every one of those character signature sounds. And that's where pulling that into the DAW really helps, is because I know that you've got sounds for each one of these characters that you're going to need to be able to hear in order to connect with that emotionally. And now I have to make sure that this, like, if I've got like 5 different tracks that might come in and out, depending on what you're doing and who's in the scene and all that, I got to make sure all 5 of those work with those sounds. So it gets...
Well, gonna be like, so keeping your characters all the same, would you use the same key in the same game as much as you can, or is that still just like not enough of a variance?
It depends. Like, if you have a game that's really super open world, like Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, something along those lines, where there aren't a lot of transitions between areas, then I would use primarily the same key and sort of tempo. The stuff in Tears of the Kingdom might be a little bit bad of an example, because a lot of it was not very rhythmic. It was kind of like little musical flourishes more than like a steady soundtrack. But if you have a good place to change that is if you have transitions between areas. So if you think in Zelda, when you go from the overworld to one of the main dungeons or inside one of the shrines, now you can change something because the character's already on the loading screen. You can change it up. And so if you have this kind of world, like that new Bethesda game, the Starfield, you transition between, you're on a planet, you get in your spaceship, you fly, you're in your spaceship flying around, you go to a different planet. You have these transitions between areas, and you can do a lot of just new composition for each area if you want to do that. I think it does help with consistency if you keep things close. And there are music theory ways to do that. You can use the circle of fifths and just go to nearby key signatures and it will still sound similar. But I think if you're in an area and you don't have like a clean break in gameplay between those areas, you have to keep it consistent. Otherwise, things get confusing.
That makes a lot of sense. I think the circle of fists is when I started to be like, I can't do this. And composition, it is so much like I talked a lot with our composer for films. Like he mostly composed our films, and
Sure.
he was always saying it's like you learn all this music theory, and you get as much grasp as you can, and then you realize when you can throw it out the window. Like, but it takes so much studying and making sure like things are actually working, why it works, and why it sounds like it works, and then attempting to like meld with it. And I think that was a really interesting thought.
Yeah, I would say my first half of music theory was learning the rules, and then my second half of learning music theory is learning how to break them.
That's insane.
And so, and a lot of it is trial and error. It's still your ears, just like doing audio. And I think you'd agree, like sometimes you just got to try and see what sticks. And if it doesn't work, if the note's in the wrong place or the sound effect is too bright or whatever, you go in and you change it. And you might do that 100 times, and it might get really repetitive, and your ears are going to get tired, and you got to get up and take breaks. But that's just part of the creative process, and you can't get discouraged if you want to be creative. You got to take the million failures to get to the one success.
Definitely. Taking a break is honestly something I'd always just make sure is on everyone's mind. So your ears have a limit. You eventually start hearing things, or if you just work too long in the day without a break, and then you come back the next day and you listen back to what you did, you're like, what am I listening to? What was that? I don't know what I was on. It's because your ears, they're fatigued. They get ear fatigue. Always take a break if you're feeling even slightly creatively tired. If you're just like, I just need to do that, just take a break, step away.
That's brilliant advice. When you're working, especially if you're working, I guess more deeply, where you're really having to listen for sounds and how they fit together, how often do you usually take a break?
It'll, even if it's like not even a full break, let's say I make like 3 variations of something, that's normally when I have to just like stop, because then my variations start getting way too similar to each other. There's nothing different. But instead of taking like a full break, maybe just moving on to a whole different sound effect, be like, okay, that's that for now. Flip your brain around. Because I will just like end up making the same sounding and be like, oh, that's good. And I was like, oh, I already did that. It's like you just like stop realizing what is different about it. And it's strange, but I would always recommend the moment you're just like, I don't know what else to do. Move on to either something, another sound effect, another aspect of what you're working on, or just go eat a snack, come back.
There's real neuroscience behind that. It's like a real phenomenon with your ears, and that goes back to the fact that they're always working. Like they're always transmitting data into your brain. But the taking a break and giving them a chance to kind of rest and giving your mind a chance to rest is super important. Well, I was going to say something and I can't remember what it was, but so I'll just move on. But with that, and as you're working through that, it seems like if you're working on a video game and you have potentially thousands of sound effects that you're having to go through, it takes a lot of organization.
Oh yeah.
How do you keep that straight?
In the sound effects world, I just make sure I have a bunch of sessions. Like I'll make sure this session is specifically like a certain level, or this session is a certain sound. So like if I got a clip from the director of one of the motions they're doing, which is like their walk cycle, that is its own thing. I could not try to fit in like 12 different other cycles in that session. I'll get lost. It's hard to like keep your tracks together because it's not just like one sound for their footstep. It is normally 3 or 4, maybe even 5 in that cycle. So you need like 5 tracks just dedicated to different sound effects, and then from there you could even do like extra instrument tracks or effects tracks, and that would just get way too muddied. But it's really just making sure like from your base, like when you set up your like working folder, your project folder, like this is this character or player underscore footstep, player underscore jump, player, like always just keeping everything as labeled and as separated as you can from each other, or you will get absolutely lost.
Sure, sure. Do you have like a checklist or anything like that that you go through and you're like, okay, this is my level and I gotta make sure I hit all these sounds and I've been bouncing around from session to session so that I can give my ears a break. This one I think is done. Let me check that off. Do you have something like that?
Yes. So a lot of the times, a director or whoever is like handling or producing the game will have an asset list,
Mm-hmm.
and I take that asset list and I make my own spreadsheet, and I have everything listed out that I need to make sure I hit, and I'm like, done or approved, not approved. It's like done, approved, not approved. So I know to check off. It's like, oh, this is made. I had 5 variants of it. All 5 variants are checked. Did they get approved? And then yes. And then so you always know. Because other than that, you would just 100% be like, oh shit, I never gave that guy his jump.
Right.
Definitely, I would. Excel is your best friend, or Google Sheets, whatever you use. It's mandatory in that type of world when you're doing 12 variations of a single man's footsteps. Like,
Yeah.
because you need those variations, otherwise it just sounds repetitive. You only did 2. It's random what your ears can pick up on, but they do.
It's really, really, you can pick up on a lot more minutia than you think you do. And one of the things that I'm running into is in a game engine that I'm working on right now is I have an intro and a beginning and then like a looping section. And the game engine itself doesn't want to play them seamlessly. And I can preload the sounds into memory using the game engine, but it still has a short delay there, and your ear can pick up on something I think as short as like 6 milliseconds.
Jeez, I did not know it was that sensitive.
And drummers will play, and their groove will be off by like 10 to 15, 30 milliseconds, and it will give the drum groove a completely different feel over like a drum machine, which plays it directly on the beat. And so it's learning to listen to those things, I think, is really important, and pick up on like, because it's really easy to get into the sense of like, did I just hear that? Something was odd there, I think. I'm not really sure. Like, you have to start, and then you kind of let it go, and because you don't hear anything weird again. And so it doesn't, you put it out of your mind as you're focusing on other things. But you have to really like learn to like trust your ears and go back to that and say, what did I hear there that's wrong?
You brought up an interesting point. We're kind of almost hitting an hour, but I want to touch on this. When you're like composing and stuff, you're not always playing the instruments, and so there's a tendency to be perfect with it. How do you bring in like the musician's musicality of it? Because like there is like error in occasionally playing, and it's not always perfection. You can't always just be perfectly on the beat. So how do you always like try to compensate for that?
No, for sure. There are a lot of different things that you can use. Some of the more fancy sample libraries from, say, Contact, they're more expensive. They kind of do some of that for you, where they'll select different samples, even though you're playing the same note, and so it will get variations to it. You do velocity variations, and you can actually go into your DAW, depending on which one you have, and do MIDI effects that will provide some randomization to that. Ableton and most DAWs have a groove feature now where you can take a groove from an existing like hand drummed sample, and you can extract that groove, and it will modify the timing of like a drum groove. And you can even apply it globally so that like your bass is playing with the same kind of like variations and stuff like that. So there's a lot of things that you can do. I think it's harder with orchestral sampled instruments, even though those Contact libraries do include the variation. orchestral players are so dynamic and so expressive that it takes a lot of automation and a lot of minute work from note to note to get the appropriate expression to make it sound like it's an orchestral piece and not something that you built on a computer. So it takes longer, but in the grand scheme of things, if you're a game studio and you have a piece that you want to include in your game and it's an orchestral piece, it's a lot less expensive to pay one guy to go in and mess around in a DAW for a couple of days than it is to pay, 150 piece orchestra to go record it. So, but the more you do it, the faster you get at it, and the more you can start kind of hearing those human things. And you have to, even when you can't hear it, you can still hear it. Like it becomes a thing where I don't even know, especially if I've been working for a while, I don't even know if I'm hearing a difference, even though I've slid the slider and moved the knob and clicked the checkbox and all that stuff. I don't even know if I'm hearing a difference. But even if you aren't consciously picking up on it, you still have to trust that like your brain knows. And a lot of subtlety goes a long way.
That makes a lot of sense. I've definitely had that too, even like doing compression. I'm like, am I hearing it on? Is it working right now? And then that's one of those times I'm just like, I just need to step away, or I crank it extra hard, or I know I'm hearing it, and I'll just like slowly go backwards.
Right.
Like, that was too much.
And like in the audio like design world, like it's really easy, I think, to go really overboard on like the pitch variation, for example.
Oh, I've done that 1,000 times. I'm like, oh, that sounds fine. And then like I was mixing on headphones, and I hear it on a speaker. I'm like, oh, that has bass, and it could not have bass in it. Ooh.
Yeah.
That's also another thing from like last episode, just knowing what you're hearing, like knowing what your device is giving out, like being familiar. Like I know these things give me a pretty good amount of bass for just being headset, but it's not true.
Sure.
So always keep in mind that you need to listen to at least a couple different speakers before you send it out.
Absolutely. Great advice. Well, I think that's about an hour for us. Is there anything you'd like to add before we cut out of here?
Just like next time you're playing a game, really listen to like the little things you would notice. Like, oh, did him touching his backpack make a sound? Give props to your local Foley artists.
Right. You'll start to hear these things the more you pay attention to them. So.
And then also in composition, listen, like when you change environments, what changed?
Mm-hmm.
Really training your ear to just notice those little subtle things that we talk about, and it'll make you appreciate how hard someone worked on your favorite games.
And if you're getting into game audio, that's a really important skill to be able to compare what you're doing to the work of others to see, what did they do to make that moment emotional and effective. So.
Definitely.
Well, I think that about wraps us up. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.